On the morning of March 19, 1997, the chief geologist of Bre-X Minerals stepped from a Bell 206 helicopter over the Busang jungle in Borneo and fell 240 meters into the canopy below. 4 days later, a body, partially consumed by animals in the swamp heat, was recovered and identified as Michael de Guzman. Within the week, the independent assays commissioned by Freeport-McMoRan from its own confirmation drilling at the same site would return results the mining industry describes with a single deflating word: insignificant. The gold that had made Bre-X the most valuable mining stock in Canadian history had never been in the ground. The structural question this episode answers is not why a body fell from a helicopter. It is this: how does a company report a mineral deposit that does not exist, sustain that report across 3 years of drilling, and carry a market capitalization of over 6 billion Canadian dollars, when the entire enterprise rested on a physical sample that any competent laboratory could have tested in an afternoon? The answer is not in the geology. It is in the point at which a rock sample stops being rock and becomes a number on a page. Bre-X was not a story about lying about gold. It was a story about controlling the moment of measurement. Begin with the mechanism, because the mechanism is the entire case. In hard rock mineral exploration, the value of a deposit is established through a process called assaying. A company drills a core sample from the earth. That core is a cylinder of rock, brought to the surface, logged, split, and sent to a laboratory. The laboratory crushes the sample, subjects it to fire assay or another analytical method, and reports the concentration of the target metal, typically expressed in grams per ton. Those numbers, aggregated across hundreds of drill holes and modelled statistically, produce a resource estimate. The resource estimate is the asset. It is what the market values. It is what the reserve reports certify, and it is what banks and investors lend and buy against. The integrity of that entire chain depends on a single unstated assumption that the material tested in the laboratory is the material that came out of the ground. Everything downstream, the resource model, the feasibility study, the share price, the takeover premium, is built on the presumption that the sample is genuine. The industry in 1997 had built almost no procedural defense around that assumption. The chain of custody from drill core to laboratory was, at most exploration companies, an informal matter. This is the gap. This is the space in which Bre-X operated. Understand what a fire assay legitimately does. When a sample is fire assayed, it is not weighed and inspected. It is destroyed. The rock is crushed to powder, mixed with fluxes, and melted at temperatures above 1100 degrees Celsius. The precious metal collects in a lead button, which is then cupelled to leave a bead of gold and silver. That bead is weighed. The result is a number. The original rock no longer exists in any form that can be re-examined. This is the ordinary and correct method. But it means that once a sample enters the assay process, the question of what that sample actually was becomes unanswerable. The measurement consumes the evidence. Now consider the second physical fact that made Busang possible. There are 2 forms in which gold appears in ore. The first is hard rock gold, gold locked within a mineral matrix, angular and irregular in shape, the product of the rock's own formation. The second is alluvial gold, or placer gold, the kind panned from riverbeds. Alluvial gold has been transported by water. It is rounded. Its edges are worn smooth. Under a microscope, the 2 are distinguishable to any trained mineralogist. Alluvial gold is also cheap and widely available. In Borneo, it could be purchased from local panners. The legitimate purpose of understanding gold morphology is quality control. A geologist examining core samples should be checking that the gold present is consistent with the deposit's geological model. If a supposed hard rock deposit contains rounded alluvial grains, that is a red flag that something is wrong with the sample. The morphology of the gold is, in effect, a built-in authentication feature. A hard rock deposit that returns alluvial gold is telling you that the gold came from somewhere else. So the mechanism, stated plainly, was this. Bre-X salted its core samples. It introduced gold that had not come from the Busang deposit into the crushed rock before assay. Once salted and assayed, the samples were consumed, the numbers were recorded, and the numbers became the resource estimate. The resource estimate became the asset. The asset became a share price that rose from pennies to over 280 Canadian dollars, adjusted for splits across roughly 3 years. The mechanism required only one thing to remain undetected: that no independent party ever tested a sample the company itself had not first handled. That is the baseline. Now the architecture. Step 1 was the acquisition of the property and the establishment of control over the physical site. Bre-X, a small Calgary exploration company, acquired an interest in the Busang site in the province of East Kalimantan on the island of Borneo in the early 1990s. The site was remote. Access was by helicopter and river. This remoteness was not incidental to the fraud. It was structural. It meant that the number of people who could physically reach the drill core was small, and that the logistics of moving samples from site to laboratory passed through a narrow, controllable channel. When you control the only road out of the jungle, you control what travels on it. Step 2 was the drilling program itself. Over the course of the exploration, Bre-X drilled a large number of holes and produced a steadily escalating resource estimate. The published figures climbed from a few million ounces to, ultimately, an announced estimate in the range of 71 million ounces of gold, with company figures at times suggesting the deposit could be larger still, approaching or exceeding 200 million ounces. To grasp the scale, 71 million ounces would have made Busang one of the largest gold deposits ever identified. 200 million would have made it the largest in the world by a wide margin. The estimates did not merely suggest a good mine. They suggested a generational discovery. That escalation was itself part of the architecture. Each new drill result, each upward revision produced a new price catalyst, and each price catalyst drew in a new tranche of investors and analysts. Step 3, and the operational core, was the handling of the core samples. The record established through the subsequent investigations, including the report of Strathcona Mineral Services, the independent firm later retained to conduct due diligence, describes a sample handling process that departed from standard industry practice at precisely the points where authentication would occur. The drill core was, according to the Strathcona findings, not systematically split and archived in the ordinary way. Half a core should be assayed and half retained, so that any result can later be verified against the preserved material. At Busang, the process by which samples moved from the drill site to preparation to assay created windows in which the material could be, and the evidence indicates was, tampered with. Step 4 was the introduction of foreign gold. The Strathcona report, which remains the foundational forensic document of this case, reached a conclusion it stated in unusually direct language for a technical report. It found that the Busang gold samples had been tampered with, and that the deposit did not contain an economic quantity of gold. Strathcona's investigators re-drilled 23 holes adjacent to Bre-X's original holes. Where Bre-X's holes had shown rich mineralization, Strathcona's adjacent holes showed effectively nothing. Two holes, drilled meters apart, cannot return radically different results in a genuine disseminated deposit. The geology does not permit it. The only explanation consistent with the physical evidence was that Bre-X's samples had been enriched after they left the ground. The gold used to enrich them, the investigation determined, was of a character inconsistent with the Busang host rock. It bore the morphological signatures of gold that had been transported by water, alluvial gold, the rounded grains of placer material rather than the angular gold of a primary hard rock system. Some of the gold, the analysis indicated, was consistent with having been shaved from jewellery or otherwise sourced externally. The point for our purposes is structural, not sensational. The authentication feature that should have flagged the fraud, the morphology of the gold, was available for examination at any time. The question is why, for 3 years, no gatekeeper examined it. That is the detection failure, and we will come to it. Step 5 was the conversion of the salted assay numbers into a financial asset. This is where the mechanism leaves the jungle and enters the capital markets. The escalating resource estimates supported a valuation. Bre-X's shares traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange and, through the Alberta Stock Exchange and later broadly, became one of the most widely held speculative positions in Canada. The company's market capitalization reached into the multiple billions. Major institutions took positions. Mutual funds held it. Pension funds held it. The Ontario Municipal Employees Retirement System and other institutional holders carried significant exposure. The stock's rise was not the product of retail mania alone. It was validated by the participation of sophisticated institutional capital, and that validation drew in more capital in turn. The salted samples had become, through the assay and the resource model and the analyst coverage, a genuine financial asset held on the balance sheets of serious institutions. Step 6 was the takeover contest, which is what ultimately forced the fraud into contact with an independent laboratory. Busang's supposed scale attracted the interest of the world's major mining houses. A dispute arose over the rights to develop the deposit, drawing in the Indonesian government and competing suitors. The resolution brought in Freeport-McMoRan Copper and Gold as an operating partner with a stake in the project. And Freeport, as a condition of its involvement, did the one thing the entire architecture could not survive. It drilled its own confirmation holes and sent the samples to its own laboratories through a chain of custody Bre-X did not control. That is the full architecture. A remote site controlling the sample channel. An escalating drilling program generating price catalysts. A sample handling process engineered to permit tampering. Externally sourced alluvial gold introduced before assay. Salted numbers converted into a resource estimate, evaluation, and institutional ownership. And finally, a takeover partner whose independent verification the structure was never designed to withstand. Every element was load-bearing. Remove the control of the sample channel, and the fraud is exposed on day one. Now, the detection failure which is the most instructive part of this case, because the verification chain did not have a single weak link. It had a design flaw that ran through every link. Consider first the assay laboratories. Bre-X's samples were prepared and assayed through laboratories that received the material Bre-X provided. A laboratory's function is to accurately measure the metal content of the sample it is given. It is not the laboratory's function to determine whether the sample is authentic. A lab that receives a salted sample and reports a high gold value has not failed at its job. It has done its job correctly. The number it produced was a true number about a false sample. This is the crucial structural point. The laboratory is a measurement device, not an authentication device, and the fraud exploited precisely that distinction. Every assay Bre-X reported may well have been accurate as to the material submitted. The falsity was introduced upstream of the point the verification chain was designed to check. Consider next the securities analysts. Bre-X was covered by mining analysts at major firms, and those analysts issued favorable ratings and rising price targets as the resource estimates climbed. An analyst's model takes the resource estimate as an input. Given a resource of a certain size and grade and a set of assumptions about extraction cost and gold price, the model produces a net asset value. The analyst's models were, in the main, competently constructed. But a model cannot detect that its input is fabricated. Garbage in, gospel out. The analysts were modeling the consequences of a resource estimate they had no independent means of verifying, and no professional convention required them to verify it. They were, structurally, downstream of the fraud, processing its output. Consider the regulatory framework. In 1997, Canadian securities regulation had no mandatory standard governing the disclosure of mineral resources and reserves by the qualified persons responsible for them. There was no requirement equivalent to what would later exist. A company could publish resource estimates that had not been signed off by an independently accountable technical professional operating under an enforceable code. The chain of custody of samples was not the subject of a mandatory, auditable protocol. The regulatory system assumed the good faith of the sample handling process because it had never confronted, at this scale, a case in which that good faith was absent. The gatekeeper regime was built to catch misrepresentation of numbers, not fabrication of the physical basis of numbers. Consider the auditors and the financial statements. Bre-X's exploration expenditures were real. It genuinely spent money drilling holes in Borneo. Its cash flows and its expenditure accounting could be audited in the ordinary way, and nothing in the financial statements would necessarily reveal that the geological asset those expenditures were supposedly proving up did not exist. The asset was not carried on the balance sheet as gold in the ground. It lived in the mineral resource disclosure, in the technical reports and press releases, in the market's valuation of the shares. The financial audit and the geological reality occupied different documents, and no single gatekeeper was responsible for reconciling them. Now ask the counterfactual, which is the discipline this section requires. What would have had to be true for detection to occur earlier? The answer is narrow and specific. An independent party would have had to obtain a sample of Busang core through a chain of custody that Bre-X did not control, and subject that sample, or the gold within it, to examination. Not merely another fire assay, which would have consumed the salted material and returned another accurate but false number. The examination would have had to include morphological analysis of the gold grains, the kind of microscopic examination that distinguishes rounded alluvial gold from angular hard rock gold. That single examination would have collapsed the entire structure. The reason it did not happen for 3 years is that the industry's verification practices did not require it, and Bre-X's control of the sample channel ensured that no one performed it independently until Freeport did. This is why the case is a study in the architecture of trust rather than the failure of any individual gatekeeper. The laboratories measured correctly, the analysts modelled correctly, the auditors accounted correctly. Each performed its function competently within the boundary of its function. The fraud lived in the space between the functions, at the moment of sample authentication, which no function owned. A verification chain composed entirely of competent links can fail completely if no link is responsible for the specific vulnerability being exploited. There is one more detection element the record establishes, and it belongs to internal warning signs rather than external gatekeepers. Testimony and reporting around the case indicate that questions about the results were raised within the technical community before the collapse. The improbable consistency and scale of the results, the geological difficulty of reconciling such uniform high grades across the property, prompted skepticism from some quarters. But skepticism is not detection. Skepticism without access to an independently controlled sample is only an opinion, and an opinion cannot move a market against 3 years of escalating drill results and a rising share price. The skeptics were in effect correct and powerless, because the physical evidence that would have vindicated them was controlled by the party they doubted. Now the unravelling, which proceeded with a speed characteristic of frauds that depend on physical evidence. When the evidence becomes accessible, the collapse is not gradual. It is a phase change. The sequence began with Freeport-McMoRan's due diligence drilling. As Busang's development partner, Freeport drilled its own holes and controlled its own samples through its own chain of custody. In late March 1997, Freeport communicated that its confirmation drilling had returned insignificant gold values. This was the first independent test of Bre-X's samples, and it failed immediately. Freeport's results and Bre-X's results, taken from the same deposit, were irreconcilable. On March 19, 1997, before the full picture was public, Michael de Guzman died in the fall from the helicopter over the Busang jungle. The circumstances were ruled a suicide by Indonesian authorities, though the case has remained the subject of persistent question. For the purposes of a forensic review, the relevant fact is narrow. The death occurred at the precise moment the independent verification was foreclosing the space in which the fraud had operated. Bre-X, facing the discrepancy between its own results and Freeport's, retained Strathcona Mineral Services to conduct an independent review and to drill 23 additional holes to resolve the conflict. Strathcona's holes were drilled adjacent to Bre-X's original holes, so that the results could be directly compared. On May 4, 1997, Strathcona delivered its findings. The report concluded that the volume of gold at Busang was, in its assessment, insignificant, and, in language rare for a technical document, that the results at Busang had been achieved through tampering with the sample material. Strathcona found that the salting was of an unprecedented scale and character. The document did not hedge. It stated that there was virtually no gold at Busang. The market response was immediate and total. Bre-X's shares, which had traded in the hundreds of dollars at their peak and still carried substantial value, collapsed. Trading was halted. When the halt lifted, the stock fell to near zero. The market capitalization that had reached into the billions was eliminated. Institutional holders, including pension funds, absorbed losses running into the hundreds of millions of dollars. The Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, OMERS, and other institutions recorded significant write-offs. Retail holders across Canada who had held the stock as a national success story were largely wiped out. Bre-X filed for bankruptcy protection. The enforcement and legal aftermath is where the structural lesson meets the limits of accountability. The Ontario Securities Commission pursued a case against John Felderhof, the company's chief geologist and vice chairman, on charges related to insider trading and misleading disclosure. That proceeding was protracted. It ran for years, and in 2007, an Ontario court acquitted Felderhof on all counts. The court's reasoning is important to state precisely. The prosecution was unable to establish that Felderhof knew of the salting or that he had the requisite knowledge to sustain the charges. The acquittal did not find that the samples were genuine. The samples were not genuine. That fact was independently established. The acquittal found that the specific individual charged could not be proven, to the criminal and quasi-criminal standard, to have known of the fraud. This distinction matters. A fraud can be conclusively established as a physical fact, while the question of which individuals possessed guilty knowledge remains legally unresolved. Michael de Guzman, the geologist most directly connected to the sample handling, was dead and could not be tried. No one was ever convicted of salting the Busang samples. The record thus presents a case in which the mechanism is proven beyond dispute and the human authorship is, in the legal sense, unassigned. For a forensic review, this is not a frustration, it is a finding. The fraud existed as a structure independent of any single actor's proven culpability. The salted samples, the escalating estimates, the institutional ownership, the collapse, all of it is documented. What the courts could not do was attach the mechanism definitively to a convicted individual. The unravelling, then, followed the logic of the mechanism itself. The fraud depended on controlling the moment of measurement. The instant an independent party controlled that moment through Freeport's drilling and Strathcona's confirmation, the structure had nothing left to stand on. There was no gold to reveal, no partial truth to fall back on, no accounting adjustment that could reconcile the numbers. The asset had never existed. When the evidence became accessible, the collapse was not a decline in value. It was the discovery that the value had always been zero. What does this case establish about the mechanism stated as findings rather than as a verdict? First, it establishes that in any valuation chain built on physical measurement, the authentication of the physical sample is the load-bearing point. And it is frequently the point no one is assigned to defend. The laboratories, analysts, auditors, and regulators involved with Bre-X each performed their functions within their functions. The fraud lived in the gap between them. At the moment, a rock became a number. A verification system that assumes the authenticity of its inputs is not a verification system for the risk that matters most. Second, it establishes the specific vulnerability of destructive testing. The fire assay consumes the sample. Once a salted sample is assayed, the evidence of the salting in that particular material is gone, and what remains is an accurate number attesting to a fabricated reality. Any measurement method that destroys the object it measures creates a window in which fabrication upstream cannot be caught downstream. The direct regulatory consequence is documented and specific. The Bre-X collapse was the proximate cause of the development of National Instrument 43-101, the Standards of Disclosure for Mineral Projects, adopted by the Canadian Securities Administrators and in force from 2001. The instrument requires that scientific and technical disclosure about mineral projects be based on information prepared by or under the supervision of a qualified person, a defined professional who is accountable and identifiable, and it imposes standards governing the disclosure of resources and reserves. It addresses directly the gap that Bre-X exploited, the absence of an accountable technical professional standing behind the physical basis of the numbers, and the absence of an enforceable protocol governing the chain of custody and the reporting of samples. The regime does not and cannot make salting impossible. What it does is assign responsibility for the authentication point to a named, accountable person, and thereby close the ownerless gap in which the Busang fraud lived. That is the finding. Bre-X was not a failure of skepticism, and it was not a failure of any single gatekeeper's competence. It was the exploitation of a structural fact, that the industry's entire valuation architecture rested on the presumption that the sample tested was the sample from the ground, and that no one at scale was charged with verifying that presumption. The gold was never in the ground. The number was always real. The distance between those two statements is the whole of the case.